In this video, I'll tell you how to give and take critique in miniature painting. I went to college, for art, mainly graphic art and photography. That was my main emphasis stuff. Initially, more the graphic design, and then later on photography and stuff. And I've used both of those things in my professional life, my current day job, this YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff. So, but that being said, studio art classes are very different than normal college classes. Normal college classes, you go in and you learn a bunch of stuff, and then you take tests, and tests have a specific number of questions, and there's right answers and wrong answers, and there's scores and things like that. But it's a little bit more subjective with art classes. What we would do in art classes is the professor would tell us, hey, next week, like on Thursday or whatever, we're going to have a critique. And then that critique was now a target that we had to hit. We had to bring in a bunch of new work that we were doing in class that was finished. So sometimes there were some late nights leading up to critique, and then we would put them on the walls all around the entire, whatever studio there. And then the professor would go through and say, okay, so who's this? Whose is this? And you'd be like, that's my stuff. And then they would talk about it. You would talk about it. The class would talk about it. And that's how things got done. Those were kind of the milestones, across the semester. And at the end, then the professor would, pull a grade out of their hat and then give it to you. And that's, again, kind of subjective, whatever. But nonetheless, that's the way it worked. The thing that was interesting about it to some degree, and how it compares to tabletop wargaming, is we would go into those particular days in class knowing we were going in to be critiqued. And sometimes you go into your local game store or local convention and you don't know you're about to be critiqued. You should never give unsolicited advice. Now, I understand that sounds like unsolicited advice. I get that. But you came here to watch the video, so, that's all bets are off. If I had just walked up to you and said, look, this is how you should live your life, that would be unsolicited advice. When the video, it's a different thing. So I've talked in the past about people coming up to you and telling you that your paint job's not good and that kind of stuff. I think it was don't listen to paint job bullies. Pachow. And the thing is that when you give unsolicited advice, you are probably, I'm betting, probably trying to help. You are saying, look, you could get this better if you did this and this and if you stopped doing that. And that's, in most situations, coming from a place of good faith. Now, there are some folks out there, specifically the paint job bullies, as it were, who are telling you that your work is bad to make them feel better. I got no fix for that, frankly. But there are generally people who are trying to help, and they just don't realize that unsolicited advice is something that most people don't want. Some people hate being helped. I'm kind of one of them. It's a character flaw, I'll admit. But as soon as you come up and go, hey, you know what you should do with your videos, or hey, you know what you should do with the game that you designed or whatever, my brain kind of shuts off. So it doesn't actually have any help. But, there are still, even outside of unsolicited advice, there are still ways that you can help somebody if they're kind of struggling with their paint job or that kind of stuff, if you feel that you must. Generally, if you walk up to someone and ask and say, hey, can I give you some advice, that's kind of still unsolicited, even if you ask, because they're probably going to be like, I guess, okay, and that's not, so don't do that. But if you are, let's say, at the shop and you're playing against somebody, maybe somebody you know sort of well, maybe somebody you don't know at all, and they are complaining about their own paint job or, some sort of trouble that they're having with their technique. They're just like, I just wish my stuff looked better. I just it's not quite as good as I would like, and that kind of stuff. If they're complaining about it, or even commiserate, you can commiserate and go, oh yeah, but here's the thing. Don't just go, well, can I give you some advice? Again, don't go down that road. What I would do instead, which will kind of get you to the same spot, is to start by trying to gauge by how long that they've been painting. And don't just go, well, how long have you been painting? Because again, that's kind of a little bit too much. Ask them about the techniques that they use. They may be completely brand new, and this might be their first paint job, right? How was your first minis? I mean, here's mine. It's not good, So if this is very, very early in their paint journey, then, they're going to be complaining maybe a little bit about it or trying to figure out how to get better, but you want to try to not necessarily make them feel bad by how short of a time they've been painting. You want to start off by going, well, like, what about, have you tried dry brushing? Are you familiar with dry brushing? Or, like, what about, do you use washes? That kind of stuff. Ask those kind of questions and then find out kind of through that how long that they've been painting. And then once you've got a general idea of how long that they've been painting, then you can kind of address their complaint and gently tell them how that you might fix it. So you could look at it and go, well, here, and again, don't go, well, here's what I would do. I would again say it's a better idea to say, ask questions. If you ask questions versus tell people things, then they feel a little bit more agency, I think, in it versus you just coming down from the mountain and telling them what to do, at least in that type of situation. And it also depends on a lot of other things. How well do you know this person? That kind of stuff. But, the idea being that going back and forth and figuring this out a little bit, you might be able to then teach them something, which is generally better than unsolicited advice. So if you've determined that someone is relatively new to this hobby, things that you might want to suggest to them, if they're complaining about their particular paint job, if they've got a paint job that makes you a little nauseated, like a little bit in the back of the throat, just a little, but they seem to dig it, just zip it. You know what I mean? Just let them be happy with what they've got going on, please, But if they're like, gosh, I kind of wish that, like, especially like maybe, let's say you've been doing it longer and they're comparing themselves to you, which I'll get to comparison in a second. We've talked about it in the past. But if they're like, man, I wish that this, whatever, you could ask them like, well, okay, here, wet palette. Have you thinned your paints? I can tell you from going on to Reddit and looking at miniature painting subreddits and Warhammer subreddits and all kinds of different things like that, when people are asking for critique on Reddit, 9 times out of 10, the first thing is, well, you should thin your paints, because newer people have a tendency not to thin their paints and then everything looks real chalky and thick, and that's kind of a problem, right? So ask them about thinning their paints, and if they're not doing it, ask them about wet palette, because that can help you to thin your paints. If you really want to let them know, you could send them to this video, Pachow, where I teach you how to make a wet palette. It's a good idea, I think. Most people like to go down that road eventually. But you can also ask them about, well, dry brushing. Not just dry brushing, but are you using a makeup brush? Are you doing something like that? Because the makeup brushes can do a lot of work for you. Again, we can talk a little bit about a video, Pachow, about using makeup brushes and that kind of stuff. But also ask about washes. People who are new are going to ask you things about, or are going to be looking for maybe, some information about things like dry brushing, washes, and thinning their paints. Things that they may have not necessarily even known exist, but you can kind of help them with that. Things to not bring up, probably to a person who's relatively brand new. You've determined they're pretty brand new. Don't bring up like two brush blending, airbrush zenithal, edge highlighting, lots of stuff like that. There are people out there that are like, yep, you should definitely learn those things right from the get. But for the most part, you're thinning your paints, you're dry brushing, and you're doing some washes. Those have a tendency to be, things that work better for newer people, though I still use them all the time. I'm not a great painter, but I do okay. But the wet blending, the 2-brush blending, all kinds of stuff like that, airbrush zenithal. I like to use airbrush zenithal, and I even sometimes edge highlight stuff a little bit. But those things can tend to be a little bit more advanced. And telling a person, oh, you know what you should be doing? You should definitely be getting yourself an airbrush and a compressor. That's kind of difficult to do on a new person. And you need to properly kind of judge your audience, the person that you're trying to give a little bit of help and support to, so that you don't scare them away. Now, as I said, unsolicited advice, it's bad. It's just straight up bad. But unsolicited praise is not bad at all. If you see something, even one thing that they did that you think looks pretty okay on their paint job, whether they're even complaining or not, like this is a person who's sitting in front of you with models. It is almost always nice if you're trying to get people into the hobby, you're trying to help people grow in the hobby, even just be going like, wow, I really like the way you did those bases, or wow, that guy's helmet is really neat, or anything like that. Picking something out like that. If there's absolutely nothing that you can say positive, then, that's fine. You can also just, that just talk about something else and play your game and jog on. But if there's something you can point to that says, I really like what you did here, or this is pretty cool, that's going to help them feel better about what they're doing and hopefully not leave the hobby. So that's giving critique, but what about receiving critique as well? Now, if somebody gives me advice that I didn't ask for, and it happens from time to time, and I'm not even talking about necessarily miniatures and stuff like that, it could be all kinds of different things. At this age, I have a tendency to just look them just dead in the eye and just go, after they give me some advice that I didn't ask for. And generally, all but the least self-aware people will kind of get the hint and leave it alone, hopefully, change the subject. If I'm complaining about my paint job, right, the stuff that I'm working on, I'm at a shop, I'm playing a game or whatever, and I'm complaining about it, and then somebody gives me advice, what that teaches me is that I shouldn't complain in public about my paint job. You should definitely be critical about the work that you're doing to some degree. Don't be overly critical, but to yourself, you should be critical about how can I make this better? Do I want to make it better? There's lots of things you can go back and forth about. But when you're very public about it, you're going to get people who are going to tell you, well, you know what you should do. And you may not necessarily want that. Now, what if you do? If somebody offers you advice that, and you actually asked for it, you were like, hey, I trust your judgment. Can you give me some advice? And if they do that, then you should pay attention to it because they might be smart. It is very smart of you, in my opinion, to talk to people who are good painters if you are having questions, that kind of stuff. Asking for advice and then telling the person who gives you the advice that they're wrong is also kind of toxic. I've said it before and I'll say it again. You should mainly compare your work to your previous work. Is it at least as good as stuff that I have done just recently? Is it better than the stuff? Am I getting better? That kind of stuff. You should not be comparing your work to the work of the people in the magazines and online and in the contests that you see and all that kind of stuff. Those people have probably been doing it a lot longer than you have, and it would make complete sense that they are better. Now, if you do want advice, it is very important, I think, to ask people who you know to be better painters and who you have some sort of relationship with. And I don't mean like you're dating them. I'm saying if you have a friend who's a better painter than you, that's the person you should be asking. If there's a person online, on Instagram or whatever, who is a better painter than you, and you start asking them all kinds of questions, it's a little bit difficult sometimes because either A, maybe they get lots of questions, or B, they don't know you as well. Your friends know you as well. Even people who hang out at the shop that you see frequently that you know to be better painters, at least have a better idea maybe of how long you've been doing it and all that kind of stuff, and they can generally give you better answers and give you better critique. And then if you're paying attention and you're listening, hopefully you can take it as well. What are your thoughts about giving and receiving critique on miniature painting? Like, do you do it? Does it happen to you? Do people just talk to you and say, hey, you should do this differently, that kind of stuff? Let us all know in the comments. And if you can, drop a like below. It really helps the channel. Thanks for watching.